The war in Ukraine has reached a virtual impasse, stalemate. Nobody knows which way the pendulum will swing now that the conflict has entered its third calendar year. But while the Ukrainian leader Volodymyr Zelensky desperately petitions his allies for further military aid, Vladimir Putin has never appeared more assured. Why? Russia has suffered incredible losses since the start of the conflict. According to a declassified U.S. military report featured in an article by Reuters, those losses could be as high as 315,000 troops, either dead or injured. To put that into a chilling context, that's around 90% of its personnel at the start of the war. But it's not just about troops and the devastating loss of life. Russia was also hit with some incredibly harsh economic sanctions. According to a BBC report citing the UK government, over $350 billion of the country's $604 billion foreign currency reserves have been cut off. Worse still for the Kremlin, its former Western trading partners no longer want to do business with it. Certainly not to the extent they were doing business before. So why has Vladimir Putin not gone into a meltdown? Why is he cutting such a defiant and confident figure on the international stage? And why aren't people talking about a Russian withdrawal from Ukraine and an unlikely victory for Zelensky's people? The answer to these questions take us down a shadowy maritime path. In a CNN report from March 2023, Russia still managed to export a huge amount of oil. But how much is a huge amount? Try 8.3 million barrels of oil a day for size, the highest level since April 2020, all of which saw Russia's economy growing by 0.7% in 2023. While European countries have taken a step back from Russian energy exports to a certain extent, buyers in Asia most certainly have not. China, for example, boosted imports of Russian oil to 1.9 million barrels a day on average in 2022, up 19% from the previous year. A relatively gargantuan increase, but nothing compared to the demand seen in India. The South Asian powerhouse has ramped up purchases even more sharply, with an 800% increase to an average of 900,000 barrels per day. Another set of extraordinary figures, and the main reason why Putin is sitting pretty in the Kremlin as we speak. How's he done it, considering all the factors against him? And how is the oil and the gas getting to its intended destination? By slyly assembling a shadow fleet of oil tankers, Russia's been able to secretly transport its most valuable export to countries still prepared to do business with it. We've already mentioned China and India, but according to Al Jazeera, Germany, Bulgaria, Indonesia, Italy, Hungary, Croatia, Slovakia, and Holland can all be added to the list too. But what is Russia's shadow fleet? What does it consist of, and why does it present such a threat that no country could hope to stop it? Now, the term itself might conjure up ghostly images of the Mary Celeste, but on the contrary, such a supernatural analogy might not be as ridiculous or wide off the mark as you'd initially assume. Anticipating such harsh sanctions, Putin put contingency plans into place to bolster the Russian economy so it can not only support a prolonged war in Ukraine, but fulfill his longer-term geopolitical ambitions. Principally, this consisted of buying up oil tankers, a lot of oil tankers. In terms of numbers, the shadow fleet is thought to roughly be 600 vessels strong, or about 10% of the global number of large tankers currently in operation. However, it mainly consists of older container-type ships, some of which are rumored to be barely seaworthy, but more on that later in the video. By deploying the dark political arts Putin is now famed for, Russia has traded oil, with the ship's ownership being very complicated, often through shell companies in the Middle East, all with the express intention of obscuring their connections to Moscow. To give you a better idea of the size of the operation, the amount of shadow vessels leaving Russia rose from 13% in February 2022 to 42% by mid-2023. Make no mistake, Putin has arranged for his gas and oil to be transported to buyers by covert means, and it looks very much as if the West can do nothing to stop him, making a mockery of the sanctions themselves. Let's take a closer look. According to a report in the Washington Post, the G7 restrictions aimed to block insurance and other vital services for shipments of Russian petroleum sold above a certain price. As virtually all the tankers in the conventional global fleet are covered by a limited number of big insurers in Europe and the US, this provision was seen as a fail-safe way to impede the free flow of Russia's oil and gas exports. Putin's loophole? His shadow fleet is willing to operate without insurance from the big firms. The Kremlin has successfully circumvented the sanctions by disregarding these standard operating practices. Was the plan an example of naivete from the West? Most definitely. When has Putin ever played by the rules? Granted, the measures weren't designed to halt Russia's oil exports completely, They're far too important to the world economy for that to be the case, but rather to keep them flowing to markets at a lower price. However, those rules, sanctions, or measures can only be effective if the ship operators are transparent about the ownership of their vessels and what they're transporting. If the owners are hard to trace and the operator is willing to forego insurance that meets international standards, they'll be able to skirt the price caps mentioned earlier. For instance, a container could transport Urals crude to a Chinese or Indian firm and sell it for more than the $60 per barrel limit. Furthermore, Putin's shadow fleet could transport oil to buyers in nations that would prefer to keep their dealings with Moscow very much off the grid. Opaque, clandestine, underhanded. These three words are readily attributable to Putin himself, but it has proved hugely successful so far. Now we know a little more about the shadow fleet. Is there any way that the West can stop the transport of oil from Russia to the lucrative Asian markets? The answer, depressingly, is a resounding not really. According to a paper by the Atlantic Council, international law isn't on the side of NATO, the US, Ukraine, or any of their allies. Blocking shadow vessels from territorial waters or exclusive economic zones involves major hurdles and legal complexities, which makes doing so somewhere between almost unfeasible and all but impossible. The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Seas, UNCLOS, grants vessels the right of innocent passage, which means the right to freely navigate through territorial seas. The ocean is vast and the freight network complex. Piecing together the exact size of the fleet is no easy task in itself. With ownership details and any affiliation with Russia shrouded in secrecy, even more problematic is the fact that many of these vessels were acquired by undisclosed entities based in locations as diverse as Hong Kong, Dubai, Singapore, and Cyprus. Moreover, a suspicious number of Russian vessels have taken the ludicrously simple measure of changing their flags to that of other countries to conceal their ties to Moscow. It's that easy. There have also been reports of extensive ship-to-ship transfers, switching a cargo onto a vessel at sea before returning to collect more. Smoke and mirrors, sleight of hand. Now you see me, now you don't. The only thing clear, if not readily provable, is that many of the firms buying older ships are backed by Russian capital. To make these sanctions enforceable, the EU has asked Denmark to inspect tankers carrying exports from the eastern Baltic and passing through the Danish Straits. The reason? Safety issues, of course. The UN Convention on the Law of the Sea governing maritime traffic includes clauses that let states detain vessels if there's evidence that they pose a serious threat of coastal damage. However, this might lead to problems that the Danes want to avoid entertaining. Markus Korhonen, senior associate leading geopolitical risk at the Global Intelligence Consultancy, SRM, told Newsweek this has the potential to lead to either direct confrontation or dangerous naval maneuvers by oil tankers in narrow and shallow sea, the environmental implications of which could be dire. The ramifications? In that same Newsweek report, the chief executive officer of Strategic Consultants, Macro Advisory Limited, Chris Weaver, claimed that Russia has enjoyed an almost complete export volume recovery in oil after initially being hit so hard by sanctions. Worse still, there looks to be only one real solution. Realistically, Weaver added, the only way the price cap can work is if buyers enforce it. The likelihood of that happening is inconceivable. Why would China or India, for example, refrain from buying cheaper oil than their Western counterparts if it gave them a huge economic competitive advantage? Quite simply, they wouldn't, no matter how persuasive the political argument. At this point, we need to dig deeper into the safety concerns that are also at play here. As mentioned earlier, the vast majority of the vessels that make up Putin's shadow fleet are old containers. According to the same report from the Atlantic Council, there have been around 50 reported safety incidents in the last 2 years involving suspected shadow vessels, fires, engine failures, collisions, loss of steerage, and oil spills. They've occurred from the Bay of Gibraltar to the waters of China, Cuba, and Indonesia, and are the kind of maritime calamities that are expected to quickly mount up, not just because the shadow fleet is growing rapidly, but also because it's aging, making the vessels increasingly susceptible to malfunction. Due to flouting of standard regulations, another vessel's insurer or government will be forced to cover most of the expenses. Naturally, as more incidents of this nature occur, these expenses will only grow. The financial burden of carrying out many more incident responses could become unsustainable for the countries involved. So Putin makes a mockery of international sanctions and leaves other nations to pick up the bill if something goes wrong. Much more worryingly, if the shadow fleet is more or less unstoppable, what value can be placed on the ultimate effectiveness of any of the sanctions against Russia? Sadly, very little. If major players on the global economic scene are still dependent on Russian energy exports, Putin can support the war in Ukraine almost indefinitely. In yet another show of breakneck political brinksmanship, the Russian leader looks to have outsmarted the West and dodged another economic bullet aimed at the very heart of the Russian economy. But it's probably not just the fact that he's been able to do so, but with the ease which he's done it that's most concerning. With the Shadow Fleet operating so effectively, the annexation of Ukraine looking more likely, or at least a peace settlement negotiated heavily on Russia's terms, the development of the North Atlantic trade route, and unprecedented military expansion into the vital Arctic region, Putin looks to be in an incredibly strong position. But it didn't always look this rosy for the man with the keys to the Kremlin. Ultimately, his predictions of a swift end to the war with Ukraine have proved hugely wide of the mark. In response to the invasion, nearly all of Russia's big Western trading partners didn't just condemn the invasion in the strongest possible terms, but they acted quickly and decisively. According to the same report quoted earlier by the BBC, those nations targeted almost every part of the Russian economy. Let's dig deeper into the facts and figures behind the massive sanctions. Russia's home to some of the richest natural resources in the world. According to the New York Times, energy exports are the cornerstone of the Russian economy. For that reason, it was the area hit hardest. Effectively, Western nations attempted to decimate Russia's income from oil and gas. For example, the EU stopped importing Russian coal and banned refined oil imports, and the US and UK introduced a blanket ban on all Russian oil and gas imports. Germany, meanwhile, put a stop to the operating of the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline from Russia, a huge construction project that features the longest subsea pipeline in the world, costing €9.5 billion or $10.6 billion to build, and measures 1,230 kilometers in length. In addition, Western nations attempted to limit Russia's access to money on the international markets. The EU, US, UK, and Canada froze the assets of Russia's central bank. Major Russian financial institutions have also been removed from the international financial messaging system SWIFT, delaying payments for Russian oil and gas. And what about some of Russia's other valuable exports? The UK, US, and EU banned the import of diamonds from Russia. To qualify, Russia earned more than £4 billion, or $5 billion in 2021, from diamond exports. Gold exports, worth £12.6 billion to Russia a few years ago, were also banned by countries including the UK and the US in 2022. As fully expected, Russia responded in kind with countermeasures of its own. Putin has banned over 200 export goods from the West, including telecoms, medical, vehicle, agricultural, electrical equipment, and timber products. Additionally, the country is blocking interest payments to foreign holders of government bonds and banning Russian firms from paying overseas shareholders. Foreign investors with billions of dollars worth of Russian investments have been effectively banned from selling them. However, the sanctions and whatever Russia has done to try to mitigate them are just the tip of the iceberg. To add salt to Putin's wounds, Ukraine has received nothing short of unprecedented military aid packages from the West. According to another CNN report, this time from October 2023, Ukraine has been given nearly $350 billion in aid since January 2022. An eye-watering and unprecedented figure. But if we take a look at exactly what the money has contributed to the war effort, it's hard to argue that it was anything but well spent. Infantry arms and equipment, artillery, tanks and armored carriers, ground support vehicles, air defense, air-to-ground missiles, manned aircraft, explosive and combat drones, surveillance drones, coastal defenses, radar and communications, satellite services, all of which have helped Ukraine push back against the Russian advances and even recapture regions of significant strategic importance. But what's next for Russia? The Shadow Fleet, the war in Ukraine, and the general geopolitical battleground in the short and medium term. Frustratingly, especially considering what's at stake and the huge loss of life both Russia and Ukraine have suffered over the last 2 years, we probably won't get an idea of how to answer that question until 2025 at the earliest. Why? Because many leading military experts expect 2024 to be a year of consolidation on both the Russian and Ukrainian side. Despite Russia still occupying 18% of the country, it's not expected to make any major offensives in the near future. According to a BBC report, Russia lacks the equipment and trained manpower to launch a strategic offensive until the spring of the next year. Unfortunately for Ukraine, as mentioned earlier in the video, it also requires Western finance and military support to keep it in the war. Since the beginning of the conflict, Zelensky has been very vocal about the need to build up its strengths to make offensive operations and the possible liberation of Russian-occupied lands a reality. However, that hangs in the balance. Despite encouraging soundbites from President Joe Biden regarding further military aid to the tune of $60 billion, things might not be quite as straightforward as Zelensky hoped. In another BBC report, the American leader is quoted as saying, "The Ukrainian people have fought so bravely and heroically, so I'm going to fight until we get them the ammunition they need and the capacity they need to defend themselves." But while the U.S. Senate approved the motion after months of political wrangling, it still faces an uphill battle in the House of Representatives, where members of the Republican Party are divided on the matter of funding. Fast forward to November and the U.S. presidential elections. If, as is looking extremely likely, Donald Trump gains the Republican nomination and wins the general election, the future could be even bleaker for Zelensky. Historically, Trump has not only championed an America-first approach to foreign policy, but publicly expressed his admiration for Putin. Even worse, he was quoted in a recent New York Times article as saying it's, quote, "stupid for America to provide foreign aid to countries rather than loans." Plus, he's often been critical of U.S. involvement in the war in Ukraine. In his view, if European nations are worried about Russian aggression, they should spend more to fight it themselves, not constantly running to the U.S. Finally, if we turn our attention to recent events coming out of Russia, it looks as if Putin is only just beginning to turn the screw. On February 16th, the very worst news for many Russians and the rest of the watching world was released to the international press: the death in prison of one of Putin's fiercest critics, Alexei Navalny. For yet another of the Russian leader's political opponents to be found dead in controversial circumstances has outraged the West. In a BBC report, UK Foreign Secretary Lord Cameron said, "When appalling human rights outrages like this take place, we look at whether there are individual people that are responsible and whether there are individual measures and actions we can take." These are strong words, but will any of the Western powers back them up with action? That remains to be seen. Remember, Navalny is not the first of Putin's high-profile critics to be killed. Back in 2006, a former member of the FSB security services, Alexander Litvinenko, died of polonium-210 poisoning in London. That same year, journalist Anna Politkovskaya, who had reported extensively on the atrocities committed in the war with Chechnya, was gunned down outside her apartment. 9 years later, Boris Nemtsov, who served as deputy prime minister under Boris Yeltsin and who had been hugely vocal in his opposition to Putin's regime, was shot dead outside the Kremlin walls. More recently, Yevgeny Prigozhin, former head of the Wagner paramilitary group, who led a brief march on Moscow, died in a decidedly suspicious plane crash. Not to mention the unexplained deaths of oligarchs and former Putin allies Boris Berezovsky, Badry Patar-Katshishvili, Nikolai Glushkov, and Yuri Golubev. The situation is clear: if you oppose Putin, you could easily be removed from the scene permanently. None of which bodes well for Ukraine or the wider global community. Whether at home or on the international stage, it looks like Putin and his Kremlin cohorts are in an unassailable position. But if the sanctions aren't working, then what can the West, primarily the US and NATO, do to stop Russia from transporting its natural resources, bolstering its flagging economy, and continuing the fight in Ukraine? Is direct military intervention now a terrifying reality rather than a distant and unthinkable last resort? The rumblings coming out of Eastern Europe don't look very promising. According to Estonian Foreign Intelligence Service Director Kaupo Rosen, Russia has chosen a path which is a long-term confrontation, and the Kremlin is probably anticipating a possible conflict with NATO within the next decade or so. But is an all-out war with the West really part of Putin's bigger long-term vision? On the eve of the invasion, the Russian leader described the operation in Ukraine as a response to a question of life or death and was a direct result of the eastward expansion of the NATO alliance, which Ukraine has made no secret of wanting to join. As the New York Times reported, he went even further. "This is that red line that I talked about multiple times. They have crossed it." A defiant warning that the West may have cause to regret not heeding in the not-too-distant future. But ultimately, how long can Putin's shadow fleet carry on delivering such effective results? Well, if rumors are to be believed, Russia is already expanding the number of tankers in its arsenal. According to an S&P Global Market Intelligence report, Putin could potentially have around 1,900 vessels at his disposal in the near future. These are vessels of differing nationalities and ownership that have made Russian port calls and STS transfers, making them increasingly tricky to identify and trace. With this kind of transportation capacity and international law very much on his side, it's unlikely that anyone can stop Putin from transporting Russia's most valuable natural resources across the ocean. What do you think? Is Russia's shadow fleet simply unstoppable? Or do you think there's something else NATO, the US, or other Western powers can do to cripple Russia economically and put an end to the conflict in Ukraine once and for all? Let us know in the comments below, and then check out Analyzing Russia's Massive Failures in War Against Ukraine, or watch this video instead.